Thanks for coming here in the first week of term. So, beginning with a quote from my LSE colleague, Nick Barr. He says, even if all poverty and social exclusion could be eliminated so that the entire population were middle class, there would still be the need for institutions to enable people to insure themselves and to redistribute over the life cycle. Well, what do we infer from this? Well, the welfare state serves not only to relieve poverty and otherwise redistribute from rich to poor, which Nick Barr describes as its Robin Hood function, but it also serves to smooth our lifetime consumption from periods in which we're earning income from our labor to those in which we're not, and also to provide risk pooling through social insurance. Now, Barr estimates that in the UK, considering the combined effects of taxes and benefits, between 2/3 and 3/4 of the welfare state is self-financed, which is to say non-redistributive. Go ahead and find a seat. Now, Paul Krugman, along similar lines, often notes that the United States government is best thought of as a giant insurance company with an army attached to it. So when you talk about federal spending, you're overwhelmingly talking about Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and defense. Now, all of these functions of the welfare state, poverty relief, redistribution, insurance against risk, and consumption smoothing are present in the case of pensions, where the challenge is to ensure that each of us has enough income from the point at which we've retired from work to that typically unknown point of our death. Now, pensions involve transfers from those who are young, healthy, able-bodied, and productive, like most people in this room, to those who are elderly and infirm and out of work. Now, question, are these justified as redistributive transfers between distinct individuals, from those who are lucky to those who are unlucky, in order to eliminate brute luck unfairness, or are they justified on grounds of reciprocity, involving cooperation between persons, which is to the ex ante mutual advantage of each? So in this latter case, the grounds will be conceived of as involving intrapersonal rather than interpersonal transfers. In other words, transfers from one's more fortunate to one's less fortunate self, where the selves might be understood either temporally, future selves, or modally possible ways in which one's life can go. Now, today, what I want to do is try to answer these questions by offering an account of the extent to which pensions can be justified on these other grounds of reciprocity, as opposed to on grounds of redistribution. Now, in doing so, I hope to shed light not only on the justification of pensions, but also on the concept of reciprocity. Okay, so I want to begin my discussion with the following question. When should pensions be fully self-funded rather than provided on an unfunded pay-as-you-go basis? So what's a fully self-funded pension plan? Well, it's one in which your pension is drawn completely from the realization of the investment of contributions into a fund that you, and often your employer, have made during your working life. Now, the fund might be held just by you as an individual, as in the case of a traditional individual defined contribution pension pot, or as they call it in the United States, a 401k arrangement. Or, and this is what I want to talk about more, the fund might be held collectively with others with whom one pools risks. Now, private occupational defined benefit pension plans involve collective self-funding, so USS at the moment at least. Now, with a pay-as-you-go pension plan, by contrast, money is transferred from those who are currently working to pay the pensions of those who are currently retired. Now, like many other state pensions, those in the United States and the United Kingdom are pay-as-you-go. So rather than drawing from a pension fund consisting of a portfolio of assets, US and UK state pensions are paid out of annual tax revenues. Now, the pension one is entitled to in retirement is, however, based on, even though not funded by, the history of the contributions one has made during one's working life in the form of a payroll tax. Now, many public sector pensions are also pay-as-you-go. So the teacher's pension scheme in the United States is one example. Now here, there are employee and employer contributions as well, along the lines of a private occupational pension plan. But these contributions go into the coffers of the Treasury rather than being invested as a portfolio of assets in a fund. And then pension payments also come from the coffers of the Treasury. Now the contributions for public sector pensions are, however, set by means of what's known as a notional funding of the plan, which includes a discounting of the future pensions liability by an assumed rate of return on these contributions, a notional discount rate, where when it comes to pensions valuations, a discount rate is the so-called rate of interest or rate of return you can expect on the assets that have been paid into the pension fund. Now, since there isn't an actual fund of genuine assets in the case of a pay-as-you-go pension plan, the rate of return is set not as the expected rate of return R on the capital of even a hypothetical portfolio of assets, but it's rather set as the expected rate of growth G of the economy. Now, what's the rationale for setting the discount rate as the rate of growth of the economy? Well, the rationale is that pay-as-you-go pensions are funded out of tax revenues, which grow roughly in line with the growth of the economy. Now, the funding is notional rather than actual, since contributions aren't placed in a fund which is genuinely invested in assets. Rather, the assets are metaphorically conceived of by the Treasury as, in a report, claims on future tax revenue. Now, I think this analogy between growth in the genuine assets of a private funded pension plan and this expected growth of tax revenue is problematic. So on this way of setting the discount rate, so basically establishing how much, say, teachers and other public sector workers can get paid in retirement, saying like how much have you and the government contributed, and then how much do we assume that those contributions notionally grow every year to reflect the increase in general tax revenues. On this way of setting the discount rate, the pensions that public sector workers end up receiving depend on whether this metaphorical asset pool of available tax revenues increases or decreases in the future, and by how much. Now this, in turn, is going to depend on such factors as future working age population growth due to demographic changes and migration rates as the accompanying growth, migration rates and also the accompanying growth in the overall economy. But I don't think it's clear that the funding of the pensions of public sector workers should depend on such factors. For example, whether there'll be much migration after Brexit. But in any event, that dispute aside, I think we've moved some distance from the concept of self-funding at the level either of an entire generational cohort, so collective self-funding, or the level of an individual where the past contributions of workers plus returns on investment are supposed to cover their own future pensions. So when is the case strongest for an unfunded pay-as-you-go pension, as in the case of the US and UK state pensions and also many public sector pensions? I think the case for unfunded as opposed to funded pensions is strongest when there are compelling grounds to redistribute income from those who have had the good fortune to be high earners to those who suffer the misfortune of lower earnings, where such redistribution cannot be achieved by means of the risk pooling of the earnings of different people. That's in the actual ex-ante self-interest of all who enter the pool. In other words, unfunded pay-as-you-go pensions are most justified when we require the services of Robin Hood to redistribute and not just the insurance of a mutual association. Now, like a number of other unfunded pay-as-you-go state pensions, the UK state pension is in fact pretty highly redistributed from higher to lower earners. So the amount that one contributes is proportional to one's income up to an income ceiling, but the amount of one's actual pension in retirement is proportional simply to the number of years one has worked and made mandatory contributions on income that exceeds a very low amount. And therefore, money is transferred from high earners to low earners with the goal mainly of relieving poverty in old age, making sure that anyone with a full pension has at least just barely enough to be outside of poverty, to be above the poverty line. And this is known as the Beveridge, as opposed to the Bismarck approach to state pensions, where the latter approach involves more of a correlation between how much you earned and contributed during your working life and how much you receive as a pension. The Social Security in the United States is sort of halfway between Beveridge and Bismarck. Now, let's think about the Beveridge arrangement, the highly redistributive state pension as in the United Kingdom. This particular arrangement probably wouldn't be in the actual ex-ante self-interest of each to choose at the point at which one leaves full-time education and begins one's working career. This is because even at that early point, each person has a fairly good idea of whether his expected earnings will be high or low. It would probably not, therefore, be in the rational self-interest of those who, when they begin their working lives, expect to be high earners to choose a state pension along UK lines. And what we'd need to do is impose a thicker veil of ignorance, a hypothetical veil, which deprives people of knowledge of their talents and therefore their earning potential in order to render it in the rational self-interest of each to choose a redistributive state pension such as the UK state pension at the beginning of his adult life. And in fact, a Dworkinian luck egalitarian would offer just such a justification. Place yourself under a hypothetical veil. You don't know your level of talents, you don't know your earning potential, and then choose the rational pension plan. And Dworkin, which would involve redistribution, something like a state pension. And Dworkin, in fact, very briefly offers his hypothetical insurance justification for something like Social Security. Okay, well, let's assume now, for the sake of argument, certain conditions of equality. So assume that the resources and talents of everyone are known to be equal at the beginning of their adult lives, and also that each person has the same known risk of suffering future misfortune. Now, in these circumstances of ex-ante equality, Dworkinian luck egalitarianism would be fully realized without the need for tax and transfer pay-as-you-go state pensions, so long as each is provided with the opportunity to privately insure against risks at the beginning of his or her adult life. Yeah.
Just a small clarificatory question. Why do you have the further condition that no one will fall into poverty?
Okay, so the reason why I have that further condition is just to set aside the harshness objection to luck egalitarianism.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. The choice sensitivity of luck egalitarianism would also tell in favor of a self-funded approach, since one's pension is a function of the magnitude of one's contributions, which will be sensitive to one's choices regarding work and leisure over one's working life. Now, and I suppose I'll just make a point at you. The ex-ante equality imagined is consistent with people otherwise ending up jobless and destitute during their working years, so we also suppose, along the lines of the epigraph with which I began, the Nick Barr quotation, that we all know that we're going to remain able-bodied with well-paying middle-class jobs throughout our working lives. Okay, so there's not going to be the harshness problem. I think here it's all the more clear, that there would be no egalitarian case for redistributive taxation and transfer of earnings. There would and otherwise be no Robin Hood function for pensions to serve. The rationale for redistributive pay-as-you-go state pension along UK lines would be lacking. Yeah.
But there's nothing there about preferences, and if preferences can differ, and people could end up in very, very poor later on if they choose to consume everything before they get old.
Right.
And that might be a source of worry, that for some kind of reason.
Oh, you're right, that's true. So even if you're earning a steady income throughout your life, you're not going to be poor during your working life.
You might be rash when young.
Okay, right, that's true. So what Dworkin would say is, and this is one of his, I think, somewhat disreputable moves, is you take what the average person would choose. And of course, the average person would choose to have a steady source of income throughout his retirement. And you impose that on everyone, rather than, even in these circumstances of equality, leaving it each individual person's choice, where some people might imprudently choose. And he really, but if he were really true to his luck egalitarianism and its choice sensitivity, he should say, look, in these circumstances where we actually have ex ante equality, you should just let each person choose and suffer the consequences. Okay. Yeah, but that particular well, I won't really be engaging with that particular issue, but thanks for raising it. Okay, so in these circumstances of equality, there isn't, I think, apart from perhaps a paternalistic reason that's just been mentioned, there isn't actually redistributive rationale for pay-as-you-go state pensions. Maybe there's a paternalistic rationale. Okay. Now, what I want to know now is that even in these circumstances of ex-ante equality, there would remain a reciprocity-based rationale for collective funded pension plans. Collective funded pension plans would be justified as a means of providing insurance against risk, of which investment risk and post-retirement longevity risk are the most salient, not knowing how long you'll live after you retire, not knowing whether you'll retire when the stock market is booming or the stock market is depressed. Through the pooling of risks, the insurance of a collective pension plan would be to the ex-ante advantage of each against the background of equality, because when you're choosing, at least at the outset of your working life, you don't have all that great an idea of how long you're going to live. You have a much greater idea when you retire. You also, as I mentioned, you don't know whether the stock market will be high or low when you retire. Okay. And I think that pensions would therefore provide a realization of reciprocity in the Rawlsian sense of fair terms of social cooperation for mutual advantage, which Rawls situates as follows between two other notions of reciprocity. One is reciprocity as impartiality, and the other is mere mutual advantage. And let me just give you a quotation from Rawls. He says, this is not yet on the screen, the idea of reciprocity lies between the idea of impartiality, which is altruistic, being moved by the general good, and the idea of, as I should put it, mere mutual advantage, understood as everyone's being advantaged with respect to each person's present or expected future situation as things are. Everyone advantaged with respect to the actual status quo. But then he says, as understood in his preferred justice as fairness, and here's where the quote begins, reciprocity is a relation between citizens expressed by principles of justice that regulate a social world in which everyone benefits, judged with respect to an appropriate benchmark of equality defined with respect to that world. And so I think we've got something like the appropriate benchmark of equality when we have these conditions met. But we can still make arrangements to everyone's mutual advantage through risk pooling. Now I think, just note that this sort of reciprocity-based rationale, a collective form of pension provision is to everyone's mutual advantage against the benchmark of equality, might carry over to justification of a notionally funded but non-redistributive pay-as-you-go pension. And there are, in fact, some efficiency-based grounds for preferring pay-as-you-go, just through tax and transfer pension, to a genuinely funded pension plan, such as the low cost of administration, in contrast to the relatively high cost of good management of the asset portfolios of a funded pension plan, the high investment management charges and the like. Now, a Pareto efficiency-based case for a notionally funded pay-as-you-go pension might be especially forthcoming when the growth rate in the economy, G, is greater than the expected rate of return on capital. At least if we make G the per capita, as opposed to the aggregate growth in the economy. So in that case, when G is greater than R, it should be possible to provide better pensions for all by means of a notionally funded pay-as-you-go plan, in which pensions are paid out of tax revenues that increase at this rate of growth G, as compared with a genuinely funded pension plan, whose assets would, under these assumptions, grow at a lower rate of return of capital. In this case, a notionally funded pay-as-you-go pension plan could be justified as to the reciprocal mutual advantage of each in comparison with a genuinely funded plan. And Thomas Piketty and others have engaged in this big debate about whether we can expect G to be greater than R. I think most people think, well, R is probably going to exceed G for the next few decades. Okay. I want to raise the following question, and this is a question I want to focus on for much of the remainder of this talk. The question is, might there also be a reciprocity-based justification for an unfunded, not a notionally funded pay-as-you-go pension that's trying to mimic a genuinely funded pension, but might there be a reciprocity-based justification for an unfunded pay-as-you-go pension? And let's think mainly of a state pension. Now, people during their working lives make contributions that pay for the pensions that those in retirement receive in an unfunded pay-as-you-go plan, but they don't put something in return for any benefits that those in retirement confer on this group of workers. Now, one thing I want to do, and you might note, well, look, these people who are now retired contributed during their working lives to us, say, by paying money to taxes for our schooling, and fair enough. So there may be that sort of reciprocity-based, actual sort of normal, familiar reciprocity-based justification for an unfunded pay-as-you-go state pension. Well, look, those who are retired paid for our schooling when we were young, and so now we should pay for the retirement. But I want to set that aside, mainly because I'm interested in seeing whether we can still offer reciprocity-based justification that's unidirectional. It doesn't involve the typical bi-directional form of reciprocity in which parties exchange benefits with one another. And here's how we might try to do this. Let's explore the following. Let's try to draw an analogy between pay-as-you-go and other pay-as-you-go state pensions and other intergenerational arrangements, where these other intergenerational arrangements are plausibly characterized as reciprocal, even though in a way that I'll describe in a moment, they're unidirectional in nature rather than involving the typical bi-directional exchange between parties of reciprocity. In fact, one good example of this is what's known as the just savings principle, Rawls's just savings principle. That might actually provide a nice analogy to pay-as-you-go state pensions, and also a plausible case of reciprocity that runs in only one direction. Now, Rawls maintains, quotation, since generations are spread out in time and actual economic benefits flow in only one direction, there's no way for later generations to help the situation of the least fortunate earlier generation, where these generations at least are non-overlapping. So each generation therefore benefits the next generation by saving for it, but not in exchange for any benefit that the next generation confers on it, at least not through the pension system, leaving aside taxes paid for schooling. Now, in spite of its unidirectional nature, I think a case can be made that Rawls's just savings principle is grounded in a principle of reciprocity involving the notion of fair return to a party other than the party from which one has received the benefit. Rather, any given generation is obliged to benefit the next generation in return for a benefit it has received from the previous generation. Now, let's have a look at Rawls's own arguments for his just savings principle. Well, his main argument involves, I think, an appeal not so much to reciprocity, but to a principle of universalizability. So this is what Rawls says. It says, from behind the veil, we choose a savings principle. We choose how much we'll save for the future. We choose a saving principle for our own unknown generation on the assumption that all previous and future generations adopt the same principle. We choose on the assumption that every generation adopts the same principle. And then he says, quote, up for the screen, the correct principle is that which the members of any generation, and so therefore all generations, as he's given universalizability, would adopt as the one their generation is to follow, and as a principle they would want preceding generations to have followed and later generations to follow, no matter how far back or forward in time. Now, among the requirements of this principle, are that each generation saves for the next at least as much as the previous generation saved for it. Okay? Now, alternatively, and Rawls sort of hints at this, here's another way you might try to justify the just savings principle. One might try to justify it by means of an appeal to his famous principle of fairness, the principle of fairness that he derives from H.L.A. Hart. Now, what does the principle of fairness say? Well, roughly speaking, one has an obligation to contribute to a cooperative scheme that's triggered by the fact that one has received benefits from that scheme, even if involuntarily. Well, do we have a cooperative scheme? In the case of the just savings principle, I think it might be conceived as a form of cooperation, insofar as it's to the mutual advantage of each. Now, along these lines, and here's a quotation, Rawls writes, if all parties are to gain, except perhaps the earlier ones, and I just want to flag that there's something unique about the earlier parties, which sometimes causes problems. It causes problems in one direction with the just savings principle, another direction we'll see later with pay-as-you-go state pensions. So Rawls says if all parties are to gain, except perhaps the earlier ones, which don't actually gain much from a savings principle, the parties must agree to a savings principle that ensures that each generation receives its due from its predecessors and does its fair share for those to come. Okay. Now, perhaps the charge of free riding, the principle of fairness charge of free riding off the efforts of others, can be invoked to condemn those who benefit from the savings of their ancestors without in turn passing on comparable savings to their descendants. Now, this doesn't involve an appeal to reciprocity in the normal sense involving bidirectional exchanges between parties, but it might be thought plausibly to involve a version of reciprocity or a form of reciprocity somewhat more widely understood. Okay, well, can we extend this idea to pay-as-you-go state pensions? Well, there's a following, I think, disanalogy between Rawls's just savings principle and a pay-as-you-go state pension. A pay-as-you-go pension plan differs in the order in which benefits are received and contributions are made from a savings arrangement in which each past generation leaves savings for the next generation. Okay, in the case of savings, the members of one generation receive a benefit from the previous generation. The previous generation is invested in a manner which benefits the next generation. And receiving a benefit from the previous generation might plausibly be thought to generate a duty of fairness to provide a comparable benefit to the next generation. But note this difference with the pay-as-you-go pension plan. A pay-as-you-go plan reverses the direction of benefits. Workers of the current generation, and call the current generation GN, provide benefits to retirees of the previous partially overlapping generation. We don't have backward causation. They're providing benefits to the previous generation overlapping GN minus 1, people who are retired. And the thought is, if we're going to try to extend this analogy, well, that's meant to give rise, the fact that workers have benefited their elders, is meant to give rise to an obligation on the part of the workers of the next generation, GN plus 1, to provide benefits for workers of the current generation when they retire. But then the following question arises. Why should the fact that members of the current generation, GN, have provided benefits to members of the previous generation, GN minus 1, give rise to an obligation of fairness on the part of members of the next generation, G plus 1, to provide benefits to members of G, and likewise G plus 2 to provide benefits to G plus 1, and the like. So, I mean, think about it this way. At the point at which they're allegedly obliged to contribute to the retirement of members of the current generation, members of the next generation haven't yet benefited from anyone and will actually never receive pension benefits from the members of either the, of any of these other generations which are being benefited. But I think, however, that one can respond to this challenge by drawing attention to the following fact. And this is where we bring in the thing that I mentioned at the end of the abstract, a Nash equilibrium. One can respond to this challenge by drawing attention to the fact that members of G plus 1, the next generation, and others, future generations, might each benefit from general conformity to a norm which calls for the provision of pay-as-you-go pension benefits. So a world in which each conforms to such a norm to contribute to the previous generation might be better for each than a world in which nobody conforms, but rather each person hoards benefits for himself rather than giving anything to anyone else. Yeah.
Do you need a strict Nash or just a Nash? Because when you say each does better for himself by conforming is strict.
Okay. So non-strict is not worse, or is that,
Yeah,
okay.
non-strict means you could get the same by not conforming, but you can't.
Well, so this one is actually a strict Nash equilibrium. I'm not sure, I think it would, I mean, that's something we should pursue in discussion. I think it probably might make a significant difference.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah.
Since we're on that kind of technical sort of thing, I mean, since you haven't specified exactly what the game is, whatever it is, I mean, let's not do that now, but whatever it is.
I will in a moment.
Oh, you will? Okay, I'll wait.
Okay, yeah, so we're going to give you a simple version of this in a moment. So, yeah. Okay. So a world in which each conforms to this norm might be better for each than a world in which nobody conforms, but rather each person hoards benefits for himself rather than giving benefits to anyone else. Okay. Moreover, a norm where G n's benefiting Gn minus 1 gives rise to an obligation that Gn plus 1 benefits G, that Gn plus 2 benefits Gn plus 1, and so forth, might be self-sustaining because conformity to it might be Nash equal. I'm sorry, I'm not sure whether I'm repeating anything because I got thrown off by the question. This might be justified. It will become clear when I provide the example as self-sustaining because conformity might be a Nash equilibrium, a strong Nash equilibrium, an equilibrium in which each does better for himself by conforming rather than defecting, given the choices of others. Okay. Right. Okay. So now I want to give you the example, and this is something that Alex drew my attention to. His mentor Ken Binmore has written about this. So in a manner analogous to that of an unfunded pay-as-you-go pension plan, but at the level of individual members of a family across overlapping generations, Ken Binmore has argued that conformity to a norm of benefiting one's elders might be such a mutually advantageous Nash equilibrium. And here's Binmore's example. He asks us to imagine a world in which only a mother and a daughter are alive at any time. Each player lives for 2 periods. The first period is her youth, and the second is her old age. In her youth, a player bakes 2 large loaves of bread. She then gives birth to a daughter and immediately grows old. It's a very traumatic thing having to raise a daughter. Or child, I should say. Old players are too feeble to work and so produce nothing. Now, one equilibrium requires each player to consume both of her loaves and bread in her youth. Everyone will then have to endure a miserable old age, but everyone will be optimizing given the choices of the others. All players would prefer to consume 1 loaf in their youth and 1 in their old age to engage in consumption smoothing. But this fair outcome can only be achieved if the daughters all give 1 of their 2 loaves to their mothers because, and this is crucial to the example, bread perishes if it's not consumed when baked. Now, Binmore offers the following explanation of how such a strongly Pareto superior fair outcome can be achieved. He says, mothers can't retaliate if their daughters are selfish, but the fair outcome can nevertheless be sustained as an equilibrium. In this fair equilibrium, a conformist is a player who gives her mother a loaf if and only if her mother was a conformist in her youth. Conformists therefore reward other conformists and punish non-conformists. And he says, to see why a daughter gives her mother a loaf, suppose that Alice, Beatrice, and Carol are mother, daughter, and granddaughter. If Beatrice neglects Alice, she becomes a non-conformist. Carol therefore punishes Beatrice to avoid becoming a nonconformist herself. If not, she'll be punished by her daughter and so forth. And then this, I guess he needs to add this assumption. If the firstborn player is deemed to be a conformist, you have to add some little wrinkle into the rule so that the firstborn player doesn't have an ancestor, Eve, right, doesn't have an ancestor to give to, she just automatically becomes a conformist. If the firstborn player is determined to be a conformist, it's therefore a perfect equilibrium for everyone to be a conformist. Okay, right. So I'll continue. Okay, so I mean, I just wondering if you can ask this, right? So now Joseph Heath is written quite a bit about pensions and tried to justify them on grounds of mutual advantage. He employs a similar model to try to show that unfunded pay-as-you-go pension plans embody what he describes as a form of indirect reciprocity, involving intergenerational cooperation. So let's see whether, in other words, let's see whether we can extend the Binmore case to the case of this big, huge collective pay-as-you-go state pension arrangement. Now, Joseph Heath tries to show that unfunded pay-as-you-go pension plans embody a form of indirect reciprocity involving intergenerational cooperation where the benefits flow in one direction only. Workers of one generation pay for the pensions of those in retirement at that time in return for having their pensions paid by the next generation of workers when they reach retirement. Now, for reasons similar to those that Binmore presents, Heath maintains that a pay-as-you-go pension plan is a mutually advantageous arrangement in Nash equilibrium. Well, I think here's a problem for Heath's attempt to extend this account to a huge state pay-as-you-go pension plan. The problem is that he doesn't provide a credible account of how individual members might be moved to contribute to a pay-as-you-go pension plan. So note that in a pay-as-you-go pension plan, a worker's pension contributions are anonymously spread out among a group of strangers, rather than, as in the Binmore case, directed to individuals with whom one has special ties. The choices of individuals to make contributions to a large anonymous plan can't be explained as a socially enforced norm that gives rise to a Nash equilibrium. Rather, there's a need and there exist enforcement mechanisms which ultimately involve the threat of state-imposed punishment. So in the case of a state pay-as-you-go pension, contributions, the eliciting of contributions is explained by the fact that the state makes them mandatory in a manner that's backed up by the threat of punishment. The state couldn't rely on individuals voluntarily making national insurance contributions in accordance with a norm that gives rise to a Nash equilibrium any more than they could rely on the voluntary payment of various other taxes. Now, think about an employer-based pay-as-you-go pension, like the teacher's pension scheme. There, I think members don't voluntarily pay pensions contributions into their employer's plan on the understanding that, look, if we do this, then the next generation of workers is going to voluntarily put in contributions to the pension plan in accordance with the norm conformity, which is a Nash equilibrium. Rather, what underpins such a employer-based pension plan like the teacher's pension plan is rather simply a standard reciprocal and legally enforceable contract between the members of a given generation and the institution that promises them a pension in return for their contribution, where the institution is the state, actually, in the case of a public sector pension. Now, they don't really exist. I think they could exist in theory. They don't exist in practice. But if there were a pay-as-you-go defined benefit private occupational pension plan, that would also have to involve a promise by the employer. It wouldn't be sustainable in other respects. These couldn't be sustained in the absence of an enforceable promise of a bilateral contractual nature that the employer sends to workers. Well, if a voluntary norm in Nash equilibrium plays any role in explaining how state pensions are sustained over time, it will need to be at the collective level of the demos rather than the level of individual. And this point that something Alice pointed out to me. So let's see how it is that we can actually appeal to this Nash equilibrium of the Binmore configuration to explain how it is at the collective level we have something like a voluntary Nash equilibrium. Well, state pensions contributions, as I've noted, are mandatory. But, note also the following, the state tends to provide itself with a fair amount of discretion in pensions that they end up paying people in retirement. So unlike the contract between employer and employee for an occupational pension, the state pension isn't underpinned, I mean, maybe metaphorically they probably talk about the social contract, but it's not underpinned by a sort of bilateral reciprocal contract between the state and the individual, in which the state actually promises each individual a given level of pension in exchange for his contributions. I think if you always read about what you can expect in retirement from your state pension, there's always this caveat, we can change this if we decide to. The state pension can be altered at democratic will, in other words. The fact, however, that states continue to voluntarily pay pensions of the pay-as-you-go type might be explained by the following Nash equilibrium at the level of the collective. Voters choose democratically to continue to make contributions to pay for the pensions of those in retirement, not just because the elderly vote in disproportionate numbers. That's a large part of the explanation, but not the entirety of the explanation. There aren't that many elderly people. Voters democratically choose to continue to make contributions to pay for the pensions of those in retirement, not just because of the elderly, but also because workers realize that if they vote to stop making contributions towards the pensions of those in retirement, then the next generation of workers will vote against making contributions towards their retirement. So, assuming that the members of the different generations are equally situated, this mutually advantageous Nash equilibrium might be described as an instance of the type of Rawlsian reciprocity that I introduced earlier. Remember the quote? One which involves a relation between citizens expressed by principles of justice that regulate a social world in which everyone benefits, judged with respect to an appropriate benchmark of equality. Okay. Well, so do we have an argument that a pay-as-you-go state pension is in this form of Rawlsian Nash equilibrium? Well, the problem remains. The assumption that there's an equal benchmark from which people depart is unsound in the case of a pay-as-you-go state pension, in fact. And we'll see that the first generation, remember I mentioned that there's a special problem with the first generation in these cases. First generation is privileged over the others, and hence we don't really have the requisite benchmark of equality. Let me explain. Unfunded pay-as-you-go state pensions involve the prima facie unfairness of the first generations getting a free ride, since the first generation made few, if any, contributions into the system. So let me give you an example. Social Security in the United States. The first American to receive a monthly Social Security check had paid only $24.75 in contributions over 3 years when she received her first monthly check, and her first monthly check was $22.54. So after her second check, the first beneficiary of Social Security had already received more than she contributed. And in fact, this particular individual ultimately lived to 100 years old, collected a total of $22,888.92. Now, moreover, in practice, not only the first generation, but every subsequent generation in practice receives a net subsidy from younger generations. Now, as Paul Samuelson has observed, state pensions such as U.S. Social Security are actuarially unsound. Everyone who reaches retirement age is given benefits that far exceed anything he's paid in. Well, here's his explanation of how this is possible. He says, it stems from the fact that the national product is growing at compound interest and can be expected to do so as far ahead as the eye cannot see. Well, his eyes, unfortunately, couldn't see. Now, there are more youth than old folks in a growing population. More important, with real incomes growing at some 3% a year, right? The taxable base upon which benefits rest in any period are much greater than the taxes paid historically by the generation now retired. Okay, one second. Now, Samuelson and others have characterized this arrangement as a pyramid or a Ponzi scheme. Okay. We can see why it would be open to such a charge in a case in which workers' own contributions fail to cover their own pensions, which are as generous as they are only because the population is growing and there are more workers per pensioner whose contributions are combined to provide the pensions of single individuals. Now, here's a thought though. Perhaps, however, pay-as-you-go subsidy of each generation by a younger generation can nevertheless be justified in a Robin Hood fashion as a form of redistributive transfer from the younger to the older, when the younger are better off than the older on a per capita basis. And this is in effect an egalitarian transfer from the richer subsequent generations to the poorer previous generations. Yeah, Jason.
So I just have a question about some of the stuff the Simon says. Maybe is this meant to be just a descriptive statement of fact? Because if you look at, say, like China or Japan, even though the population was growing because of the fact that they enforced the one-child policy and people were living longer, you could have a growing population, but still not actually the case with always there being more use than the old folks, right?
Right. Yeah.
So, I mean, is this meant to be just an analysis of the actual facts on the ground, or is this meant to be like a sort of idealized pyramid Ponzi scheme for?
Okay, so he was describing. So this is something he wrote in the late '60s, and he was basically describing the United States and I guess in Western Europe. But you're right. I mean, so there is a something that perhaps we could discuss in the Q&A. But there's an interesting question as to whether funded versus pay-as-you-go pensions can better deal with the change in the dependency ratio, the proportion of elderly people and the number of years they'll live in retirement to the proportion of workers. But yeah, so he's making a statement of what things look like in the United States and Western Europe in the late 60s. Okay. Now, unfortunately, things aren't that way anymore. It's now much less clear. I mean, even when we can confine ourselves to North America and Western Europe, it's now much less clear than it appeared back then that subsequent generations will be better off than previous generations. So according, for example, to a study by the Resolution Foundation, in the past, the average incomes of each generation, and this is talking about the UK, have been higher than those of previous generations when they were the same age. But this crucial progress has so far not held true for millennials, whose incomes after housing costs are no higher than Generation X before them, and certainly something that Samuelson didn't foresee. And this is true not just of the UK, but I think it's true of a number of other OECD countries. So it's therefore no longer clear that pay-as-you-go intergenerational transfers can be justified on these Robin Hood grounds, where each generation, at least on per capita basis, and perhaps also it's helpful if the population is growing, is better off than the previous generation, and so there's the backward transfers, redistribution to each previous generation. Okay, well, let's now introduce the following assumptions. So I think if there were no increase, if there were just sort of equality between generations, there's no increase in per capita income and wealth of subsequent generations, and also let's assume the life expectancies of members of different generations are similar. Of course, that is growing, although it's now seems to be growing at a much slower rate than expected in the UK at least. And let's also suppose that everyone has earned a decent income over a lifetime. There would no longer be a redistributive rationale for unfunded state pay-as-you-go pensions, in which everyone in a given generation is taxed to pay for the pensions of the members of previous generations. Rather, in these circumstances of equality across generations, there would be a strong case, I think, for people to pay their own way by means of the self-funding of pensions, entirely out of the past contributions of workers and their employers, simply facilitated by state regulation to overcome collective action problems. Now, the mutual advantages of risk pooling that one can reap from cooperation would establish the case that these self-funded pensions should be collectively self-funded by each generational cohort for its own retirement, rather than individualistically funded. And these pension plans could get off the ground without unfairness as a result of a collective decision by the founding generation to enter into an association with one another to save for their own future. And I think this sort of funded pension plan would fully realize this Rawlsian ideal I mentioned earlier of reciprocity as fair terms of social cooperation for mutual advantage measured against the benchmark of equality. Unlike an unfunded pay-as-you-go pension plan, there'd be no inequality among the parties here, since the first generation to benefit will also have contributed their fair share, unlike actual unfunded pay-as-you-go state pensions. And I want to now just, before opening things up to discussion, mention that I think it's sort of an interesting theoretical possibility. When we reflect on this, we can see to what extent unfunded pay-as-you-go pensions do and don't actually realize the principle of reciprocity. So the question I want to raise is, could there be an unfunded pay-as-you-go pension plan in which the first generation to receive a pension in retirement makes contributions into the plan before they retire throughout their working lives? Now, unlike a normal pay-as-you-go plan, these contributions wouldn't go towards any pensions in payment at the time, since by hypothesis there would be none. There's the first generation of this unfunded pay-as-you-go pension plan. So there aren't any retirees for them to, for their contributions to pay the pensions of at that point. Now, if we imagine that the first generation who contributes during its working life, no previous generation involved in the scheme, the contributions of that generation are invested, ring-fenced, and held in reserve for the payment of their own future pensions, and we then provide the same arrangement for subsequent generations, well, that basically transforms the arrangement into a funded, perhaps a notionally funded, it transforms it into a funded pension plan. But let's consider another possibility. Suppose that the pensions contributions of the first generation are instead invested, ring-fenced, and held in reserve to pay the pensions for the retirement of the final generation of contributors during their working lives in the event of eventual plan closure. This also gets around this problem of backward induction. If you assume that, of course, the pension scheme plan is not going to go on forever, it's eventually going to end. And what about that last generation that's contributing and won't get any contributions in retirement? Perhaps we can discuss that problem as well. In addition to getting around the problem of inequality between generations, the first generation gets a free ride, it also gets around another problem of a pay-as-you-go plan, of backward induction from the final generation. Okay, so what are we imagining now? We're imagining that the contributions during their working lives of the first generation are invested, ring-fenced, and held in reserve to pay the pensions for retirement of the final generation of contributors during their working life in the event of eventual plan closure. Now, in this case, all generations would be equally situated insofar as each generation's contributions pay the pensions of another generation. Here, each generation would pay the pensions of the previous generation, I'll get to in a sec, in typical unfunded pay-as-you-go fashion, except for the first generation, whose contributions would loop forward to the final generation. Now, apart from the fact that the first generation's contributions would be held and invested in a fund for the last generation, this would be an unfunded pay-as-you-go realization of Rawlsian reciprocity. I mean, it is, however, probably merely an interesting theoretical possibility. No actually existing pay-as-you-go pension plan has ever involved such arrangements, nor is its future implementation likely.
Yeah, well, does this argument depend on the existence of discrete generations?
Don't think so.
Because you're saying this generation, which implies there's some point in time that the thing starts paying out, but in practice there's people, age 60, 59, 58, and so on, so it's really a continuum.
Right.
And that seems to make it much more difficult for this to work, I thought.
Okay, well, we just need overlapping. So explain how it is that this becomes more general. I mean, what if we just spoke of generations as people who retired in a given 2 decades or something like that?
Yes, so there's going to be some point at which a person who's retired one year later gets something a person who retires 1 year earlier doesn't.
If it closes.
Yes,
that's right, yeah.
So, or even when it starts, there's going to be some point at which it starts paying out.
Okay,
and
right.
the first people to benefit will have people 1 year older than them who didn't benefit.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I guess that's probably so. I think this is probably just a harmless simplification. But you're right. Even in the even in the Social Security case, there's a first person to receive Social Security, and oddly, that person has contributed for 3 years. I don't know why it wasn't just a single day and then but whatever. But I think that basically we get the same problems of there being an initial group of people that get a free ride, and you're right on an individual basis. The sort of earlier parts, the sort of the people who start receiving earlier rather than later, free ride to a greater extent. Okay, and then I suppose that we have to. I think it would be useful to think of different ways in which a pay-as-you-go pension scheme ends, and it makes a difference how they end. I mean, so we might think that the most realistic scenario, especially these days, is some horrible apocalypse, right? That leads to the end of the pay-as-you-go pension scheme. But then we don't have. We don't. Yeah, exactly. So we don't, in this case, have a generation that put in all these contributions to people in retirement, which doesn't receive pensions in this retirement because they don't, I guess, but because they're all dead. So we need to think of a case where they're still alive, and then the next generation just decides, "Oh, to hell with it, we're not going to pay pensions." And but you're right that it'll have to it'll affect different people at different ages to different degrees. Okay. No, so that's the main part of my presentation, and there are various other things that we could talk about. But why don't I'll just stop now and open up for discussion.